Still, if you need me to bring some of you a little bit up to date from the last taping, I was going to continue with some of that. When I speak of the human nervous system in a certain way, and specifically about the wet and dry brain, understand that the nervous system, with my old diagram, that anything that is not simply the direct physical motor activities, and anything that is not part of the limbic reactionary system that seems to be human emotions. Anything that's not that is what I'm talking about, because that's what I am referring to as simply the cortical intellect. Instead of drawing a line up there as I usually did about a certain level of intelligence, just consider literally, physically, from the brain stem up, I'm talking about the brain. Now, the thing I brought up last time about wet and dry brain, to you people, maybe getting this on tape at some other time in some other place, I repeat, is not simply for the sake of me making up terms. What I'm describing does not physically exist as simply as I'm putting it, but what I am describing is a reality that is thus far unmeasured. It is unnumbered, it is unnamed, and therefore I got to call it something. And what I'm calling it, before the night's over, some of you may find to be interesting that I plucked those two terms more or less out of thin air. Well, at least it's not obese, but it has a kind of surprising at times literal correlation, two aspects of reality, in the way in which it's connected with what I mean by these two aspects of the thinking mechanism. I was trying to give you some description last time, and let me give you another one of me saying the brain, and we're still remembering, I know there's only one brain. You don't have two brains. You don't even have separate nervous system parts. The cortex, the brain, is not in any way separate from the motor and the limbic systems. You got to remember that. But to talk about things, you have to arbitrarily cut them off somewhere, in the same way that you have got to arbitrarily start sentences and end them apparently somewhere. But what I'm talking about is a reality. And if you try to picture it perhaps this way for tonight, the wet brain is like at the core of the brain itself. It is the older part. And I don't mean just in the sense that sometimes, not even zoologically or biologically, they try to refer to older parts of the nervous system and the brain stem. It's not all that. Just consider it as an older part, and I think you'll see why in a second. But it is, if you would try to picture it, just picture the brain as a nice round ball. All right? Why not? It doesn't cost anything. It's not going to hurt you. All right, consider that we got the wet part. It's in there at the center. It is the wet, chemical, older, primary part of the brain. And don't try and tie it in with things about older parts of the brains that you may have picked up somewhere from reading in biology or physiology, because I mean something else. You can take it as a complete operating entity that is the wet brain. It is like, or it is not unlike, a kind of savanna area. It's almost like a living swamp. And around it, not physically exactly, I know, but around it has now grown into the dry part. But it is like it is floating. It is almost like algae floating on this wetland. It is a kind of add-on. It is a more recent function of the brain. What I refer to as the wet brain is directly connected to what I have pointed out to you in the past also, in another way, primary activities. Activities absolutely from any ordinary perception. Activities that are absolutely necessary to sustain life. just sustain life. That is the specific area of importance to the wet brain. It is activities of a primary nature, and as you might guess, I would refer to the dry brain as being that area connected to, in charge of the needs and activities of a secondary nature. Very specifically, after this has expanded, and I repeat one more time so anybody doesn't get too confused or think I'm too confused, I am not insinuating in the face of accepted physiological reality. I'm not trying to tell you that the brain physically, materially, is structured in a way that conflicts with any known anatomical reality. The operation they don't understand, and that's what I'm talking about. This added on the dry part. It was the basis of it, and it's still the basis of it. One of the specific purposes of the dry part is to verbalize aspects of the wet part in very, very specific ways, such as, how about the difference, since this is a fairly important part of life, that is death, the difference between death and talking about death. The dry brain has a secondary interest in all operations of the wet brain. And part of its interest, part of its purpose is to produce a kind of tolerant map of those activities that originally are based in the wet brain. Specifically, since I used death, how about this? The dry brain part does not simply put a name to death somewhere back in our hoary past, if we'll assume that three-dimensional evolution took place more or less as they say, which is good enough for our purposes right now. Somewhere along the way, as man began to talk, the dry brain began to operate. It began to name things that the wet brain had no name for, since it does not talk. And one of undeniable importance is death. That is, the lack of continuing life. The dry brain, though, did not simply name it and tell the wet brain of, hey, that's death. That's when it's all over. It didn't simply name it and then say, hey, that's it, and walk off. The wet brain, the dry brain, put a name on this which had heretofore had no name. But then the map was tolerant, because it pointed out that, well, now here's death. But no, wait a minute. Have you ever heard of Allah? Have you ever heard of the gods? You mean you don't know about the afterlife? You don't know about that? No, this is just a stage. Now, whereas, if you follow this kind of map making, which you've got to by now, if indeed the older silent part, if the wet brain could talk, now it can't, but the sentence makes sense, I'm going to say, if it could talk, if things had developed where it could talk, then I've got to tell you it would tend to be too direct, much too specific, such as regarding death, and it would tend to frighten and discourage man. Because if the wet brain could talk about such matters as death, and it began to talk one time, it would have said, hey, that's death, and it's going to happen to you, and that'd been it. And assuming that you had a dialogue going on inside that went along with the wet brain taking up talk, you would have been, shall we say, frightened, upset, disoriented, perhaps for the rest of your life. That's it? I mean, that's it? That's absolutely it? And the wet brain, I told you what it was, that's it. There are parts of being alive that once they reach a level that you would normally think of as being intellectualized, that it can be talked about. There are aspects of life that if they were put into words by the wet brain, if things did arrange themselves as they had it evolved in that way, what it would say would be much too blunt. The maps, that is the information, what it said would be very strict. It would be a very unencumbered verbal motif. You would not have the Baroque kind of curls, apparent byways, possible variations of the information that you have got with dry brain activities. It's almost as though the wet brain, this younger, this add-on, but understand it would not be operating. Not originally, it would not be able to function now were it not being fed by the wetness of the older brain. That's all it knows. In the same way, if you can follow, that secondary activities are all some outgrowth of primary activities. There's no such thing as a unique, a standalone secondary activity. Fashion is nothing but a secondary version of dress. Dining, secondary version of eating. Eroticism and love, a secondary version of sex, etc. The dry brain would not be operating. If in some way it had come into existence and there was no wet brain, we still wouldn't know about it. It would be like a potential. As far as it having anything, it would be vacuous. I could say the potential is there, or it's self-contradictory. But if I said it could have been there, but if when it came into existence the wet brain went, well, okay, now I'll knock off. I've been at it for 5 million years, so you take over. And if it did that and walked off the stage, it'd be like a man that took the music with him, and the dry brain would just stood there the rest of his life and not have anything to do. But since that is not the relationship, what I was going to point out about the tolerant maps that it makes, it's almost as though the wet brain has become a kind of polite, concerned, humane instructor that is like it talks to men, and of course they talk to each other, and they discuss things like death. They discuss things that seem to be almost too shocking, seem to be almost too blunt, but then people talk about things. They talk about not just death, of course, variations even of that are still pretty serious, of health. Look how much people talk about health, even if they're not sick. They'll talk about it, but the latest illness they read about, they've even got brand new ones that show almost no symptoms, which, you know what that means, and both parties go, yeah, phew, yes I do. But rather than it being some mode to laugh at people, they talk about such as that, their love life. They talk about the estrangements that may be going on in their family structure. And it seems like it's a lot of sitting around talk, that if you were sitting outside and you were generally wired up not to be that involved with this scenario, you could look at it in a pretty cynical manner, or at least sarcastically, like, Jesus, why do people keep talking about all that stuff? I'm giving you another even closer to the chemical basis. That it is one part of one person's brain. It is not just an intersocial. It is not just a sociological phenomenon. It is the brain in one person of having this wet function, this older, silent operation of the brain that is primarily in charge of primary activities. And it has its kind of modern-day counterpart. There's an add-on. It is just hanging around the periphery, the external, if we consider it spherical, area of the wet brain. And not just physically, but it's the operations, it's the verb there. And it's as though it's serving almost a purpose as a kind, considerate instructor to the old brain. Like, well, you don't know anything about dying. And you're almost talking, let's say, to a dog. Not a perfect parallel again. But it's like the old wet brain can almost go, and you could almost fool yourself and think, well, it knows what I'm talking about, and it doesn't, really, because it doesn't talk. But it's though the dry brain is trying to say, all right, I've got a word for it now. You don't understand. People just disappear as far as you know. In the same way, if you died and didn't show up tonight, you're a dog. All it knows is, you never came back to his house. He liked you. You're always around, but you never came back. He doesn't know anything about dying because he got no word for it. It is as though the dry part, the dry operation of the brain, can say, there's a thing like people die or disappear. And it's almost as though the wet brain can go, like a dog, like you imagine he's trying to hear you. And it's almost as though it is trying to play out a role of being, look, it's not as bad as you might think. Because the majority of people in the world believe that after you die, you're born again in some way. It could be worse. In fact, all right, if you don't believe me, why don't you go back and here's a book that I just found. Let's read it. I've read it once, but I'll read it again with you. And it's about people that's almost died and came back, they said. Or it's about a religion you never heard of. And look, they're very specific about what happens to you. It's almost as though it's a kindness, a kind of attempt to alleviate the bluntness that would be the kind of information, I repeat again, if you can follow the purpose of me drawing out this erroneous sentence, if indeed the wet brain could talk, the kinds of things it would say, if it talked and you still had some kind of internal dialogue with a talker and listener that you could hear, the things it would say would make an uneducated, dyed-in-the-wool, Alabama, Mississippi, South California, or South New Jersey bricklayer, ditch digger, the kind of things they'd say. If they just walked in the house and you had a brother like that, and you said, what's new? And he said, Mama died. What's new? Your house burnt down. If it talked, it would be, what's going on? Your wife left you. If it talked, anything it had to say about primary matters, which is the only thing it would be interested in, it would just say it. And if you still had some sort of, me playing with the justice of it, if you still had some sort of civilized hearing in you, you'd sort of be crushed, wouldn't you? Discouraged that that's the information I'm getting, rather than, and forget any sort of cynicism or any kind of wired up resistance you give to religion or religious type stories. Notice they permeate all of history. Stories about love, about life after death, all sorts of things around the edges that seem to take the bluntness off of primary activities. And what they're saying is almost on the line of, it's probably not as bad as you think. A lot of people say it's not that bad. A lot of people say what we're seeing is not actually the way things are. There's another aspect. How about as long as man has had the idea of there being a subconscious mind, and by now all of you surely know Freud did not originate it, that was the newest version. But the idea that there's something else going on, that spirits are talking to man, simply as I put it sometimes, there is a dialogue going on that you always take as being in some form you. There's noise going on above that red line. The wet brain never stops. Never stops. The idea of the subconscious, the idea, whether it was called that or not, but the idea of the subconscious, or people believing that there are things that we should know, but we just can't seem to put them into words or fully realize them. Consider that synonymous with subconscious. There is that feeling in people. You don't have to be schooled in Western psychology. All over the world, as long as man's been leaving history written, somebody's been pointing out that there is this feeling that there are things in me, and surely in humanity, there are things in me that I almost know. Just things that I just almost know them. Yeah. And I can't seem to get them out. Are you ready for a more chemical, and those of you who get good even go past chemistry? I'm going to tell you what's going on from this view tonight, which is even closer to the material reality of it. That whole notion is simply based on this: the continuing activity of the wet brain, which outstrips the dry brain's vocabulary. That it never has caught up, and there's no reason to suppose it will, trust me, with enough words to describe what's going on. And it's not just the quantity, it's the wet brain is operating faster than you can talk. And you could not, even if you had enough words, the dry brain could not, it would have to start talking to make Donald Duck sound like he was on 400 amphetamines an hour. It simply could not talk fast enough. But I would suggest that the more proper way to first look at it is simply that the wet brain has more activities going on continually than the dry brain has ever, will ever, I suggest to you, have sufficient words to describe. But the dry brain knows that there's more going on than I'm talking about. It simply knows it. It's not in question. But the idea that it's in some way psychologically embedded in people, that is from the environment, that it's some way outside their genes, outside the molecules of their own body and nervous system, that idea is simply a dead end if you're ever going to try to get off this planet in your own nervous system. It is not that. It is that the wet brain has continuing activities, that the wet brain has a continuing inadequate verbal supply to cover. That's it. But it has a notion of it. It has an idea that I'm not talking enough, I'm not talking fast enough, I can't cover all this. And it comes out in a certain kind of, not necessarily life-threatening, but a kind of frustration that poets, would-be religious people, some ordinary people, they want to say, sometimes I feel like I do things, or I keep doing this one thing, and I feel like I don't want to, in a way. And I can't seem to stop it, or vice versa. And if they have to think about it at all, if they were a little more tied up in backwards paths, they might say, well, and if they were still wired up to be religious, they could say, well, it's evil forces make me do it. If they were a little more up to date, just in the general mechanical sense, they would say, well, it's some sort of unconscious desire. There's something probably that happened to me when I was a child that makes me want to engage in self-defeating activities. There's something, I believe if I could bring this information up, whatever it is that seems to be motivating me, if I could in some way bring it up, I believe I'd be free of it. Now, you've surely heard that. That's almost part and parcel of psychiatry or talking analysis. The fact is, they almost said something. That if I could bring it up, what they're saying is, if the dry brain, if the newer activities did, for whatever reason, in fact take up describing what this is going on, that I'm not sure what it is, but it's stuff that I don't think I like. If it could start talking about it, I believe there'd be a difference. Or put it to you another way, how about the times that ordinary Western analysis talking analysis, or those of you getting good, kinds of talking that oftentimes goes on under religious guise, confession, or talking to a priest or a rabbi, or people talking together, family and friends. That's what I mean by talking analysis. But when it seems to work even under clinical conditions, are you paying someone to listen to you talk? Do you understand what the attempt is? I put it to you kind of in another guise the last time we were taping, but it is a kind of attempt for the dry brain by way of words to alter the chemistry of the wet brain. Anytime somebody attempts to change, and somebody attempts to change somebody else for their own good, for a politician to try to get you to vote for him, for Procter & Gamble to try to get you to change to their brand of washing powder, for your family, for your lover to say, listen, why don't you quit drinking? Why don't you lose weight? Why don't you gain weight? Do you know what all that is? Forget what it appears to be the garb of it in words. What they're attempting to do is to get you to change your brain chemistry. And it's the same thing if you say, I should quit drinking. I should do something about myself. You're attempting for the talking brain to make the wet brain change its chemistry. When it does seem to happen, this is of no great consequence, but when talking analysis, when somebody says, God, I feel much better now I said that, it doesn't have to be actual paid professional analysis for the psychiatrist. Sometimes people under certain conditions, it's either happened to you or you surely can hear what I'm saying, that it's in life, maybe it's some stressful moment, seriously stressful to you, it would seem. Of course, to be more specific and keep you up to date, that is, your brain chemistry reacts in such a way that you take it as being very stressful, and it almost squeezes your juices in a way as to make you act out of the ordinary. Let's just try and keep it on the up and up, folks. Don't say I ever misled you. But what seems to be a stressful condition, at times somebody can suddenly and say something, admit some deep dark secret they had at their mother's funeral, or something terrible's happened in life, and they'll turn to somebody, their husband, their wife, and make some confession or make some statement that all my life I've lived a lie in a certain way because I really feel so-and-so. I always wanted to do so-and-so. I wish I'd never done so-and-so. And they do it, and it happens, and it seems like some sort of small moment of epiphany in people's lives. It happens, and they will say for a while, they're over it pretty quick like everything else because life's got to be stable, but people will go, Jesus, I wish I'd done that 30 years ago. I wish I had admitted that I had wanted to do so-and-so, or that I always held you responsible for such. God, such a relief. I feel like a new person. When that does happen, and oftentimes, as I said, it seems to be stress, that is something external, or it can happen in combinations of stress and maybe a few drinks. The whole thing is, when something seems to have happened that was actually, to the person, an extraordinary feeling, event, and that talk seemed to have been, if not the enzyme, the actual agent itself that caused this feeling of relief and happiness, some kind of liberation. We're talking about one thing and one thing only. That apparently in those conditions that talk, and perhaps with the aid of alcohol or something, but even talk by itself seems to have altered the chemistry of the wet brain. That is what happened. That's what psychiatry is about. That's what making confession to a church is about. That's what people talking to each other is about, or that's what, as I was just saying, seems to at times happen to people almost on their own under certain conditions of, damn it, I'm going to say this. I'm sorry, I'm tired of holding this in, and you go blah, 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 blah. And people say, God, I wish I'd done that years and years ago. I feel so much better just admitting that or just by stating that. Nothing strange. It is nothing ephemeral. It is nothing spiritual. It was apparently that talk had a direct effect on the chemistry of the wet brain. I mentioned that me coming up with the terms wet brain and dry brain had a couple of further interesting If not, if we were Greek, serendipitous, if there is such a word, aspect to it. Could you follow this if I pointed out that as I tried to draw you a parallel in my descriptions of the wet brain and primary activities, and conversely the dry brain and secondary activities, since I use those terms, can you see that secondary affairs are dry and primary affairs are indeed wet, not just figuratively? Sex, eating, you got to have saliva, you could not eat, they're wet. The other basic one, to preserve your physical being, involves getting out of the elements, and it's wet. That at a certain view, the primary activities always are wet as opposed to dry. The primary activities, the secondary activities can also be seen as being dry. They arise from the wet area, the chemical churning of the brain. I did point out, I didn't stop, that the wet part never stops. Never stops. And when the dry part even wants to, a lot of you are people that come in here off and on, one of the first things many people want to do is think there's some kind of great secret about dreams. One thing that dreams are, as long as I'm here, is the wet brain never stops. And it's like this, sort of. This is not the only way to look at it, but since the question continues to strike some of you as being potent, potentially, which is not necessarily, but as there it is, the dry brain is ready to take a nap, to go to bed, and the wet brain never stops. If it did, you're in bad trouble. The wet part of the brain, that activity never stops, and it's like just periodically it wakes up the dry part again and makes the son of a bitch dream. But it's to the point that in a certain way that in the same way that if you got up and you've just been asleep several hours and tired and the phone rings and you get up, you can hardly talk and you don't know what to do. That's one of the ways to look at the strangeness of dreams, is the dry part gets woke up, in a sense, inside your own head by all this churning, by all this continuing activity of the wet brain, which never stops. And remember, a lot of what it does, the dry part has no name for, but it's going on. Remember, this description is not without some validity, even though it's not physically, anatomically correct. It's the center, the whole foundation of the wet brain, the place where it is resting, its bed when it goes to sleep at night, is still on this non-stop swamp. This wet part is always in some kind of motion, not talking. So the motion, periodically, it's as though it wakes up the dry brain, but it's groggy. And it has these strange things because nothing, as far as it's concerned, is really going on there. It lays in bed inside of your head trying to take a nap like you, which of course is you, and it's like it periodically is awakened by all this motion going on. And you don't know what it is. It's not noise necessarily from upstairs strangers. It seems to be from downstairs, and here I am awake again. Sort of. Those of you that still think you're interested in dreaming. When I said that you could see primary as being verbally, fortuitously, not dissimilar to my description of wet brain and wet activities, and then secondary activities being dry, can I push a little bit further? Could you see the kind of secondary activities in life, all the hobbies, everything that is not absolutely, as far as you could see and think, imperative to sustain life? See them as secondary activities. Not only see them as dry, you can see them as brittle. Whereas wet activities are pliable. How about a quick aside? You understand when things have a premise, they can only be true in one direction? But if they don't have a premise, they can be true in at least two. You got me? So I could point out that secondary activities are dry and brittle. Primary activities are wet and pliable. But can you see just the opposite? Maybe I didn't do the setup enough, the non-premise to premise. But could you see, in a sense, secondary activities dry and brittle? Because they have, in a sense, relatively speaking, they have no firm foundation. Whatever secondary activity it is that you're interested in life can be broken off like that. Your activity in life, all your life you wanted to be a famous composer or a writer. And it's like finally the last straw. In the case of a writer, maybe the last rejection slip that broke the camel's back. That finally you're down to submitting your stories to Family Circle or the Billy James Hargis Memorial Business Review or some crap. And even they send it back to you with a picture going, yeah! And so maybe after X amount of years of your life of trying to be this famous writer, and it finally comes back and you've been rejected by the Greenwood, Mississippi Area Literary Guild's semi-annual, and they say, not on your life, with a little, and you go, well, damn. Maybe you just finally give up. It's like it's brittle. It's kind of dry, and if it gets pushed far enough, it can break. That is, you can give up what seems to be an important hobby. Whether it seems to be of your choice or just circumstance, whatever. The thing is, it can stop, and you'll live. But in the areas of primary concerns about sex, taking it in its widest sense, that sex is one of the molecular activities of humans to continue their species, the same as many other creatures on this planet. And so whether you're going to have children or not, you just simply got to understand the molecular level. You're driven, people in general are driven to want to do it. So you look around in your genes, forget all the love and after the fact explanations, your genes make you attracted to tall blonde-headed men or vice versa, tall blonde-headed women. And you can't seem to get any. And a short red-headed guy makes himself available. Hey, I'm pliable. Just because I can't get all my life, I thought I deserve somebody that looks like Mary Steenburgen. There's some popular movie star. And you think, that's what I deserve in life. I like it. And if you can't get it, you're not as brittle. It's like, oh, who cares? I care, but Jesus, you got to screw somebody. You can't live alone. You can't. Or you can think, boy, I would love to have and you think up this grand dish or this course of food you just read in Gourmet Magazine. You think, oh, that'd be great. And you're sitting next to Burger King and realize you got $2 in your pocket, and you got to eat. Plus, we got to turn the tape over. Just a second. All right. I will assume, without any further examples, that you can see from one view, based upon the maps I am giving, that you could see that secondary activities are of a kind of dry, brittle nature because they are, relatively speaking, kind of artificial, lately outgrowths of basic life support, do or die, inescapable, irreplaceable, primary needs. So from that view, that kind of vis-a-vis view, then anything that simply is added onto that is of eating becoming dining. You can do without dining. That is, I would like to be eating at Justine's or the Four Seasons or wherever, and I would like to be having so-and-so, but I'm hungry and I'm next to Burger Doodle and I only got $2 anyway. But you don't die over it. It is like the secondary that, boy, I should have been somebody. I should have been famous by now. I should be able to jump on the Concorde and fly to Paris and eat, but I can't. I only got $2. So that kind of brittleness, it's like you cut off, it's like you can cut off dining right there, It's like cutting off a stalk of something at ground level. Hey, so what? You got to eat. It's like eat is pliable. All right? But the aside, as long as I'm here, assuming that most of you followed that it had validity, as long as something does not have a premise, it can be true in other directions, because just the opposite of that's true also. Because I can point out that primary activities are themselves super brittle. Because you can't fool around with eating. You can't decide, well, let's see, if we narrowed it down and just said, all right, the primary activities are sex, food, and shelter of all kinds. Keep myself alive. All right. 3. I don't seem like metabolically, I've never been wired up to be all that enthusiastic, and I'm sort of lethargic. I think I'll just pursue sex and shelter for a while. There is no such pliability. If you want to talk about brittle, now remember, I'm trying to get you to see that there is a land that is available when you can do it. If I got some of you got to do it, I'm going to take off. If you can see things that seem to be valid and worthwhile for you to think, as long as they don't have a premise, because they do have a premise, they only seem to point one place. You may go, oh, I never thought of that. How enlightening, how educational. But Jesus, that's kindergarten. Because if you can see that nothing that has any value has a premise, that is, it didn't have a beginning and an end, then you can see that it's true and correct and worthwhile in at least 2 directions. At least 2. That is the opposite. I can point out, if you're following this, that the primary activities are the ones that are brittle. You can't fool around with that. Now, you can fool around with dining, not eating, though. You got to eat, and you got to eat certain things. It does not have to be a full course feast from Maxine's. It could be from Burger Doodle. So you can fool around with the dining aspect of what shall I have tonight? Will I have some fancy dish, or will I have a jar of peanut butter? Now you could look at that as being flexible. But assuming that it's a primary need to eat is the one that said, let's eat, that is brittle. Because you can't decide to eat or not to eat. You can decide, well, I'll eat this because it's more convenient than that, and it's available. And you can look further as words, that is, the operations of the dry brain. Instead of being brittle, you can look at words as being a kind of expanded shift that can make available more alternatives to the primary. That you can look at it as being the more flexible. That it can bring up that the primary hollers, I'm hungry. Of course, without words, but it says, I'm hungry. And the dry brain immediately understands, yes. And it can look at a picture suddenly of some great feast, all sorts of vegetables done in the Nouveau California way. They can look at a bottle of certain champagne and wine, without it knowing why. Apparently, something very deep inside goes, yeah. But it is as though the secondary dry brain can go, no, wait a minute. Now, I know we'd like that, but Jesus, let's face it, even if we were sitting right now where they had a bottle of Rothschild, such and such year, that stuff costs a couple of $100. Now, we wouldn't want to pay that. It might be good, but look, if you're destined to have that, someday somebody's going to pour you out a glass, or you'll win a bottle. But my God, we could eat here at Burger Doodle for 3 months for that. Now, even though the wet brain, primary interest, I'm hungry, and even though I'm playing with justice in reality by saying that somewhere it seems as though it could nod in agreement and almost want to push like, oh boy, wouldn't that be good? Or that you do see up on the movie screen or on a billboard, a picture of Mary's steam virgin. And it's like somewhere deep inside of you goes, ooh, ooh, ooh. In other words, I guess ordinary people might say subconscious horniness. On a subconscious level, like, boy, that just really gets me. Then it says, oh, that seems pretty brittle. I don't know if anybody would find that punny or not. But it's as though the dry brain can go, hey, now look, she doesn't look bad, even if you did just mispronounce her name. I admit she doesn't look bad, but wait a minute, what's the chance of you getting her? I mean, it's about the same as this afternoon you jumping on the Concorde and flying to Paris to Maxine's for that $4,000 meal, right? And it's as though the wet brain down there, without knowing and without talking, goes, and it says, hey, how about that waitress that you took out last month down at the Huddle House? And it's like the wet brain goes, It's as though the dry brain is your friend, a considerate helpmate. But from one view, one of the reasons I brought this up, can you see, which I do it to you all the time, sometimes I'll skip a night and come back like I won't expand it, but can you see that that's as true one way as another, that the wet brain is pliable, it is it, which is adaptable enough that has kept us alive, and it's the dry brain, that which seems to be civilized, is certainly that which talks. In relationship to that, is pretty brittle. It's people insisting, I want my way. People making dogmatic statements about themselves. I'll tell you the kind of guy I am. I'll die for my ideals. The wet brain wouldn't die for its ideals because it didn't have any. But if it did, it wouldn't die for them. And if it could talk, it'd say, hey, stuff that. You die for them. I ain't going to die for them. I'm either going to run or I'll stand here and fight, but I'm just not going to lay down and die or say, yes, I won't change my mind, shoot me. You go somewhere else and let them do that. That's what it would tell the dry brain. All right, that is true. And I could go on and on and on, but I did enough. All right, now let's wait a second. 1, 2, 3. But the opposite, verbally, is just as valid. That the wet brain is, in fact, limited. It is almost, relatively speaking, becoming outdated. It is not plastic enough. It cannot adapt enough. Is why the dry brain had to come around. Which is why the dry brain and speech had to happen, because it's as though it sort of holds the old brain's hand at times. It's as though it can rationalize for it. It's almost as though it can sort of hypnotize it. You go, come on, come on. That waitress down there is not so bad. Or that guy next door to you, hell, you're never going to get Warren Beatty. You better grab this guy while you can. Plus, he's going to night school. He's going to become a welder. What the hell are you? Or it can say, or some other hot profession. And it's as though it can tell the wet brain, if it had to go this far, hey, look, we'd all like to fly to Paris. We'd all like to be all dressed up and eating at fancy restaurants. But hey, dude, we got to get to work. There's Burgadoodle. You only got $2 anyway. You're lucky to have that. It's as though it sort of takes care in a civilized sense, in a kind of kind, in a kind of caring, in sort of a polite way of it dealing with the wet brain. From a ordinary three-dimensional view, there's another aspect I wanted to point out. Both brains are still bipolar based. That is, a wet brain would still be on the basis of just the on and off good old evolutionary self-preserving switch of fight or flee. Eat, stop eating when you're hungry. Just the very things that we would have in common with other creatures you might observe on this planet. Just the good old basic nonverbal, physiological, biological, zoological, off and on switches. The dry brain has its own bipolar basis, but then it is in the world of verbalization. of conflicting opinions. Of anything that can be said to be true, it has its false counterpart. Anything can be said to be up, then something else is down. We all know that by now, don't we? But an aspect of this the kinds of differences that are a part of the bipolar nature of anything, but in this sense the bipolar basis in the three-dimensional world of the wet brain and the dry brain, the struggles in the latter between the dry brain bipolar part, these struggles very seldom draw blood, whereas in the wet brain it's otherwise. Pause. 1, 2, 3. But as long as we're talking about things having no premise, it appears to be otherwise. Do it not. I guess I got to color it all in, connect all the dots. Ordinary people on this planet, even intelligent people, writers, historians, political observers, and etc., if they were listening to my descriptions, and if I took enough time and they went, well, I see generally what you're talking about metaphorically, they and much of humanity is wired up, if they were listening to my tonight's ad hoc, arbitrary, premiseless premises and maps, would say, wait a minute, the struggles in life do come about from the dry part of the brain, because people do fight over conflicting political systems, theories. People do still fight right now. They're still fighting over conflicting religious beliefs, over antagonistic economic theories. But it's not so. That is not what people fight over. The dry brain very seldom is engaged in any sort of blood sport, any blood confrontations. But note that history, and perhaps your own dry brain, if you followed when I started this setup, if you had stepped into it, would have thought, well, people, especially large groups of people, nations, etc., they do fight over theories. We've got whole groups now in Northern Ireland, Lebanon, and other parts of the world fighting over religion, or fighting over World War I, was over political injustice. And World War II was an extension of that same injustice. It had to do with ideas. It had to do with the confrontation between democracy and fascism. Get away from large groups and listen. It's very seldom that there is a fist fight at the annual convention of atomic physicists, chemists, biophysicists, the AMA. Very seldom, now take it on the individual level, very seldom will a man get up and read a paper in biology, physics, zoology, and it end up either there at the podium during question and answer or later at the bar, even after physicists have had a few drinks, which is a sight to see in itself. But it's very seldom that this man is confronted by another physicist who comes up and says, I followed your paper tonight, I understood everything you said, and I'm going to tell you, as far as I'm concerned, and all the statistics I have and all the work I've been doing that you may not know about, as far as I'm concerned, you are 180 degrees in the wrong direction. It is very seldom that dry, secondary, as activities of the dry secondary brain draw blood. It is very seldom that one physicist hits another one in the nose over their conflicting ideas over superconductivity. It just almost never happens. It is misnamed, if you want to begin to see anything, it is misnamed to believe that there are groups of so-called Christians and Jews, or Christians and Muslims down in Beirut, or Protestants and Catholics fighting over religious ideas. Now they say they are. The people involved say they are. The critics, the observers, they point out the history of how this came. Do they trace it back to Mary Queen of Scots? They can trace it back to the restoration of the throne in England. They can point out what has happened historically. And they can tell the people in Northern Ireland, or they could write this down and people read it and go, yes, yes, that's true. And both sides say, and I have been unjustly, we have, the Catholics say, or the Protestants, we have been unjustly put upon, misused all these years. And everyone on this planet that has any interest in it, that's wired up to be that caught up in so-called current affairs, would say, well, yeah, even if I don't have an opinion, I'm not going to get involved. I'll tell you this, what you're describing, yeah, that is it. Their fighting, as ridiculous as it may seem, as specious as may be the basis, they're fighting over damn whether they should be Catholic or Protestant. Why don't they all join hands and be decent people and blah, 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 blah. They're not fighting over that. Secondary activities, the dry brain, that is things that are, if they could be totally separated, which they can't, but if they could, and I'd say anything that is simply a verbal matter, such as, all right, the future of this world, the only way that we're going to make it is to follow by God the doctrines, I mean the real ones, not some kind of phony baloney, but the real doctrines of Marx and Engels. Real communism works. It's just never been tried. But that is the true justice. That would put everyone on the same footing, and that's what we got to do. And somebody else stands up, either somebody else or a whole bunch of somebody else's. That is, a whole other group stands up and says, no. I've read that book. We've read that book. We've had our experts look at it, and we say that is bad news. That will never work, and I don't like it. And we'll fight it. If you believe, well, you can't believe anymore. Well, let me insist that you shouldn't believe. Not to take the obvious. If they end up fighting, it was not over political dogma. The dry brain very seldom draws blood. Now, I'm being somewhat poetic to keep saying very seldom. There is, if you can follow this a bit further, even a more interesting part. For any of you who found any interest in that. Within the total intellectual functioning of your circuitry, between the wet and dry brain, now not just the bipolar parts of the two, but between those two, there are struggles. And between those two, you can have blood flow. Not just in your skull, but between peoples, between individuals, is much of what, to dry-brained people, finds the violence of the world, individual violence, to be so heinous, to be so unpredictable, that they feel so theoretically unforgiving of it, that they feel inbred to be critics of a very stringent nature, that how could people do something like that? Now that's one person's dry brain talking, which is the voice of three-dimensional civilization and progress. But to say this is inexplicable, it's the dry brain saying, in a sense, my God, here is the living, non-verbal, dark, brooding, uncontrollable reality behind such stories as Pandora's box or the genie out of the bottle. If this thing gets loose and no amount of talk in the world can do anything, and all you can do is after the fact go, my God, how can this happen? How could somebody do that? In a contest, if there's a conflict in you, and it becomes a conflict apparently between you and somebody else, if the wet brain takes over, you can't depend upon the fact that blood will not flow. The wet brain dealing with the dry brain will not hesitate to draw blood. Now, any of you that can go one little bit further around a spherical corner, you can now take it back internally into your own nervous system. Could any of you see another view of the internal dialogue running through everybody as being the wet and the dry brain locked into this? I guess it'd be a version of Lenin's return home into this locked, windowless carriage flying back through the Eastern European countryside on its way to, God forbid, St. Petersburg or somewhere else equally as unwarm. And there it is, you're locked into this. They put you in there, and part of it wants to go home, part of it wants to stay where it is, part of it wants to deal with theory about what will happen when we get there. It wants to talk about politics, art, music, all the humane things. And there's another part that all it feels is passing bouts of horniness, its stomach rumbling. This coach is too hot. Can't even open a window because there is no damn window. And all of that is nonverbal. But all of it continues to ripple under the dry brain, and in some way, the dry brain does react to it. Does any of that sound at all familiar in a new view of apparently there being this conversation going on? People apparently saying things to themselves, believing that they should change in such a way, or believing that it's impossible to change this particular thing, or having nightmares and fears of, oh my God, sometimes I get so mad I could kill, or sometimes I get so depressed I could kill myself, or sometimes I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. Sometimes I feel like that I almost know what I'm doing, and then I can't really think what it is. It's like it's just almost out of grasp, and what they're saying is it's almost out of verbal grasp. It is that the dry brain cannot seem to put some acceptable map, some verbal template that I can deal with over the wet brain. Last time we were taping, when I brought all this up in this particular way, I said that you should say and picture biological to yourself and not psychological. It is not a parlor trick, because if you can feel it, and there is a reality, I'll tell you one more time, even though it's not exactly like I drew it, there is a reality. As long as you're alive, not only blood, but there are other juices. The neurotransmitters, as they're called, there are juices. The brain is wet. If your brain dries out, it's goodbye, Charlie. You're not going to be working the New York Times crossword puzzle anymore. You will no longer have the problem of saying, well, you know, sometimes I cannot really tell the difference between Mozart and Haydn. You'll never have that problem. This thing is wet. Now it is electrical also, but chemically it is wet. And it is the chemical flow that is passing right this second. In me, in you, it is passing for something completely, singularly unique in man, so he thinks. Thought. Although it gets twisted to where people think it's feelings at times, or where people think it's some kind of spirituality or some kind of emotion. But if you can think about it, this is it. Now it is tied with everything else. That's why sometimes I will say the limbic cortical loop. But there is, of course, the loop of the whole nervous system. You cannot separate. Your brain is not separate from the sensations that you're having right now on your rump from sitting in the chairs, or from me standing here on my feet. You cannot separate them. If you can, you're an idiot. You're committing suicide. You simply cannot. But You can feel in a way that defies everything of the general wiring structure of humanity. You're not supposed to be able to do this. Life didn't sit down and decide, well, I can't let people do that. In a way, I can tell you life never figured that somebody was going to come up with this. Of course, it did, or I wouldn't have come up with it. But it's the juices. It is up there, and it is this wetlands. And it is right in here, and it is continually churning. It is continually moving these juices in your brain, and that's what thinking is. I don't care what you're thinking about, whether you're thinking about a burger doodle later on, or whether you're trying to think about God or your poor departed mother, or that your rump is beginning to hurt from that cheap chair. Whatever it is, it may have seemed to have had some kind of sensual basis, that it is the pushing here. It's the rumbling of my stomach, of being hungry. It is being too hot in here. But none of that has any validity. None of that is even reality unless your brain juices, your wet brain, translates it. And you think about it. That's reality to you. You can feel constantly. All you got to do is just remember. And you can feel. I'm not trying to drive you crazy, because those of you that just drive you crazy, you couldn't do it anyway. Or if you could do it, you'll simply go crazier, and it wasn't my fault anyway. So there. But instead of whatever's going on, that there you are thinking about something, whatever it is. Do I have to tell you, make up examples? Thinking about something serious, something threatening, something requiring deep thought. Is just suddenly think, feel that all of this, of its wondrous nature, of its threatening nature, of its metaphysical nature, remember this, it's all juice. That's what I meant. It's all biological. That's it. Except that thing by itself, that brain, as it is, will not produce thought. That is why I have brought up and given you another description. There is, in fact, almost as though there is another brain has developed in man. And that's the part that talks. And they can be separated, which is not the point. I don't have to prove it to anybody physiologically. But they can be. Even out in the ordinary world, they know this. They don't go any further with it. They're not supposed to. But there is the brain that can operate enough to keep you alive, but it can be separated from the part that I guess they would normally refer to as human consciousness, the activities, the higher activities of the cortical area of the brain. They are as though two different functions. But you can feel, not being spooky, and I say feel in quotation marks, at least any of you want to go nuts trying to think you should be able to feel little squishy worms or some kind of, like a lava lamp in your head. So all right, I don't mean necessarily literally feel, but to remember that in the center of all this, whatever it is you're thinking right now, I mean, it's something, worrying about how you're going to pay the mortgage, or worrying about your doctor's appointment, worried about anything, no matter how complex, how frightening the thoughts are. Remember this, it's all chemistry. Thoughts are not something outside the wet operations of your brain. And one way or the other, all of you, if you're going much further with this, assuming it goes anywhere, you got to come to that. It's not a continuous thing. It doesn't stop you from thinking. It doesn't stop you from being human. But you've got to have some more understanding that I've been talking about for a long time now, that the operations that seem to be you, I've slowly tried to drag you into you. Of course, all this is my attempt, if you're going to join in, is to help show you, trick you to where you can make chemical changes in your own brain. That's all this is. And I can't trick you, really, and I can't force you, because if you give it the best shot you got, it's all you can do to have any success at this in 50 or 60 years. So it's not a point of overdoing it. But you have got to come to some place to realize that the difference in thought processes vis-a-vis the molecular, the quite physical, the chemical basis of it, the difference between that and the operations of your liver are zorts. That's the difference. That's the difference. And it's not pessimism, it's not some kind of fatalism, contraire. But that, to have any continuing awareness of that, or for you to continually attempt to remember that, will, without any doubt, if you can do it, it will have an effect on the chemistry of your brain. It is a sideways approach that I cannot describe. I'm not going to try anymore, of ordinary people. Remember my story about you trying to tell something that you drew about what it is. And it knows part of it, and you say, well, no, the other part is that you're part of it. And it says, no, I know what you drew, but that still doesn't answer my interest. And I say, all right, what's missing is what I drew it on. And it says, doesn't compute. I don't know what the hell you mean. And if I could do this to the paper and turn it up and say, well, you dumb bastard, this, you. And then it goes, oh, right? That's the same sort of thing that you've got to be able to do, that you take what seems to be you, or Peter, Paul, or Mary, or Grunhilde, or Lonesome George, and you think, well, I'm in some way, I am unique. Maybe not in a positive sense, but I am what I am, and I got to deal with that. I got to try and work with it. And I was hoping you'd help me. I got to analyze myself. I got to think about it. I need more information, and blah, blah, blah. It will begin to have, without any doubt, if you can do it, an effect on the chemistry of your brain to begin to realize that that which seems to be me, my thoughts, in a sense, is simply the paper upon which it is all writ. What I take as being my unique, personal, private thoughts, oftentimes confused with feelings and a whole lot of other stuff. But this is all it is. If it's talking, that's all it is. You begin to think in such a way that the basis of it is nonverbal. The basis of it has to do with primary activities, and the basis of it is the continuing, non-stop, 24 hours a day, chemical actions of the brain itself. Sometimes having some validity, sometimes apparently no validity, oftentimes inadequately described, but at any given second, just to think bio, just to think chemistry, just to think wet, just to think juicy. I know right now I'm having thoughts because I'm talking. I'm talking out loud, and if I wasn't talking out loud, I can stop and talk in my head just like you. I'm thinking. But it's not thinking. That's the dry version of it. What it is chemical. It's the same kind of operations, not totally unlike the operations going on right now in your kidneys, in your liver, except your liver doesn't talk. This thing has a counterpart that talks. And as it's supposed to, takes itself uniquely, seriously, individually, but unique in a way that can never describe. It just keeps wanting to clutch out and say, well, the gods have touched us. Or there's something so different about us and other creatures, which there is. There's no doubt. We're not simply overgrown raccoons and bears. There is something. But it is not something that, oh my God, I can't describe it. I just described it. I describe it almost every night. That it can be described. Oh, all right, I'll admit it can't. Until you can do that, and then you go, and then you go, and then you won't say, well, why didn't you tell me? You can feel it, not think it, not picture it. That's the way I start out trying to tell you. But just simply think, take something. There's no magic word or formula or description. But I've given you a whole handful the last time and tonight. We just think that it's right here in the center. No matter how grandiose or no matter how mundane may be what you're apparently thinking about. All right, what you're thinking about. Drop apparently. In the middle of it, right in the center of it, the core, of all of it is juice. It's wet. It flows. It's non-stop. And it has its counterpart that as this moves around, and all these little chemicals, all the electrical activity shoots around at different places, the wet part does this, and the dry part talks, thinks, but talks up here. But without the continuing movement of the wet part, it would have nothing to say. Nothing. There would be no secondary activities without primary. There'd be no dry brain without the wet. There would be no speech were it not for non-speech. No matter what you seem to be thinking, no matter how intricate, no matter how simplistic, remember this, it's all chemical. That's the beginning and the end of it in the 3D world. There's nowhere else to go with it. And your chemistry can be just slightly different. All you got to do if you don't drink coffee is just go down and find yourself a big old cup of straight, strong coffee. And those of you that don't drink coffee anymore, you should know by now. That's a drug. I'm not speaking good or bad necessarily, but within 2 or 3 minutes, your brain chemistry is different. 1 drink of alcohol. All you got to do is get in your system. Within 4 or 5 minutes, your brain chemistry is different. Your thoughts get different, do they not? Oh yeah, I guess so, but so what? What do you mean, so what? That is the so what. Nah, there's got to be more to it than that. Maybe, but you don't know that part yet, so. But cheer up. Most of you got the proper, acceptable, suitable, usable, standard issue of brain juice that you can sort of cheer up or not. But you're forever landlocked here on this planet to still believe in some way, which you're supposed to, but in some way to believe that happiness or good times or me feeling better or being more intelligent has something to do with out there. If it wasn't for this, there would be no out there. You wouldn't even have the concept of out there if it wasn't for this. And I'm not pointing at something mystical. I'm pointing at the goddamn brain. I'm pointing at the juice going on. You wouldn't know what happiness was. You wouldn't know what stress was. You wouldn't know what heartbreak was. You wouldn't know what psoriasis was. You wouldn't know what tomorrow was, or yesterday was. If these juices are cut off, you can cut off your tongue and can't talk, but as long as the juices go, you can still talk. And you hear it. It's not a direct conflict, of course, or else you are got to be, I'll admit one more time to you, extremely optimistic to believe that you can shout or to threaten or to cajole through some ordinary tone that is from your regular dry brain to holler at the right one, that is your genetic makeup, that, wait a minute, we're going to change. And the wet brain goes, right. Of course it does, and I'm being funny, but to shout out, by God, tomorrow I'm going to be 6'3". Do you hear me? Yeah, right. Which is the same thing as saying almost anything that ordinary people say that they're going to change. I'm not going to be so depressed. I'm sick of it. Do you hear me? I'm sick. I mean, it just depresses me to think about it. I'm just sick of it. I'm sick. You got to be very optimistic. Well, I'm going back to church now that I'm 50. Had a double bypass and cirrhosis of the liver. I think it's about time I got closer to the gods and lived a better life. I'm going to change. That's what I'll do. But the curious thing is you can affect your brain chemistry, but not through any bipolar method. And you're not supposed to individually, in one lifetime, undergo any particular, I'll say, radical change, which just simply means enough change that you and at least one other person goes, wow, you've changed. And it was not reversible. You actually changed. That is, to expect that to happen, you've got to be very optimistic again. But it can be done. That's what all this has always been about. It's not talking to gods or flying through the air or whatever the strange things people believe. It's quite simple. It's while you're alive to affect the brain chemistry in ways that you seem to have intended to do, or if you want another description, in ways that when you do it, it gives you more pleasure than anything else in the world. At least more pleasure than any secondary activity. At least any of you think that I was giving the slight to and a good night's sleep and all that. This is all this is about. But there is no direct way to change it, which is what I meant by you got to be extremely optimistic. For one voice, for you to say, all right, tomorrow when I wake up, I'll weigh 142 pounds. That's what I'll do. And I'll be attractive to all tall, blonde-headed women. That's it. Okay, good night. That's the same thing that people in the ordinary world believe, having to do with all forms of religion, self-help, even just on their own, to change. That my temper is so bad, I'm just going to stop it. You got to be very optimistic. Because in the three-dimensional world, and all activities that are bipolar, that are dichotomous in nature, you got to be very optimistic to believe that the dry brain is going to change the wet brain. Do you see the foolishness? It's like the penthouse and the condominium is going to say, I don't like the way things are going, I'm going to improve myself. First thing I'm going to do is go down to the foundations, the parking garage at the bottom, and I'm going to kick its ass. I'm going to tear it down. Right. We're out of tape. The insinuation is a little more subtle, a little more indirect.